Alright, welcome everybody to RIW Hobbies and Games, and today we got a ton of spoilers, and we need to talk about them because these are big.
Huge. Some of the most interesting spoilers we've seen in a while.
So, we've talked about it before, the Shocklands are rotating out of Standard, and when you're looking at any Standard format, the first thing you need to look at is the mana base. It defines what you can and cannot play. It's super important to understand how you can build decks, because the mana is the backbone to every single deck, right? And we got our cycle of lands for this set, so we need to talk about them.
Yeah, so this cycle is, we're calling it the Pathway Cycle because each name has Pathway in it. They're a series of lands that are two-colored, and you choose one option. They're flip cards. And either, as it comes into play, you choose one, you keep it on that side, and it taps for that color. And there's only one color on each side, so basically the name is actually perfect for you. You have to choose a pathway and stick to it because you're going to get that for the rest of the game.
Yep. It makes a lot of sense. And these are not a land we've ever seen before. We've never seen flip lands like this. I will say we've seen comparables in fetch lands. When Khans of Tarkir came into Standard, they were fetch lands, and they couldn't fetch duels when they came into Standard. You could obviously fetch duels later in that Standard's life cycle, but when they just came into Khans, you had fetch lands. They got one of two colors. It was always a basic land, and that was the land you got.
Yeah, I think that's actually a perfect comparison, the most apt comparison you can put out there. But I will say that I think this is already better than fetch lands in this format where you can't get duels. And the reason for that is, A, obviously you don't lose the one life. Not a big deal, but it's something. And I think the biggest thing is that you're not constrained to actually having to include those basics in a deck that might not want to be playing it. I remember the same format with Khans. Abzan would have to play Windswept Teeth because it was good with Core Sphere and help the mana, but then you'd be stuck playing 2 forests, 2 plains, 3 forests, 1 plains, but you really don't want to have them in the deck.
Yep.
And so with these lands, you're not in that same crunch for deck building.
Definitely. And I will say, too, that we've said for a while in Standard that aggressive decks have had a really, really hard time finding mana bases that worked. And when we were testing for the last Pro Tour, you know, we considered a red-black aggro deck. We considered maybe it was a red-green aggro deck. I don't remember. There was 2 aggro decks we were considering, and the mana just wasn't good. You had your Shockland, and that was good. And then after that, you had nothing, essentially. There was no other good land to play in the aggro decks, and all the tap lands you could play were really bad.
Yes.
And these are not as good as Shocklands. I do think the Shocklands are better, so we are losing those. But this land cycle is really, really good in aggressive decks.
That's a good, interesting point. Yeah, untapped lands are always great in aggressive decks. They definitely favor aggressive decks over the control decks. But I will say, though, the constraint of having to pay 2 life is something that the aggressive decks usually don't care about so much.
Sure.
And the control decks have to be a little bit more wary of.
Sure.
Although it never really stops them from playing as many as they can anyway.
Sure.
So I think, really, I don't know that I can say that it definitely is better for one or the other.
So I actually do think these are much better for aggressive decks than control decks. Aggressive decks are really interested in having the mana to cast their 1-drop on turn 1, and then be able to cast either of their 1-drops. And a lot of the times in the formats we were playing previously, you had to be a predominant of one color. You had to be either, like, you could be like a black-red aggro deck, but you had to be black dominant splashing red, and usually your red cards weren't 1-drops. They were, you know, you had like a 3-drop that had a red pip in it, or you know, maybe your 2-drop had a red pip in it, but that one was a little sketchy. For this, you can go either way. You could play a black 1-drop and a white 1-drop in the same deck because the land can produce either on turn 1.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know. The way I guess I think about it is like, you know, the fast lands were more slanted for paying off aggro decks, low curve decks. Tap lands usually favor the long game decks.
Yep.
I kind of find this somewhere in the middle. Maybe it slants a little closer to the aggro decks, but
Sure.
I think it's really just going to be something that, especially, I think what it really favors is decks that are playing only 2 colors. Because I think that, you know, a dual land is always a dual land in a 3-color deck. It always has for those 2 colors. And these decks, and if you're playing a 3-color deck, you're only going to get the 1 color the entire game.
Yep.
So I think it really discourages you from trying to be ambitious with your mana base.
Sure. Well, I was going to say the other big issue with it, too, is like if you're playing a control deck and you have very color-intensive spells, let's say something like a Kaya's Wrath, which I know is rotating, but is still a good example for this, or maybe you want to flashback an Uro. This card isn't going to help very much with that. If you need to, say you play the blue-black one, you need to play it on black early to cast your removal spell. It's not casting Uro at all.
Agreed. Yeah, so I think the things we're learning about this is that it really discourages you from playing color-intensive spells.
Yep.
And playing decks that have maybe more than 2 colors, you can't play too many of them. You can't play the full, all 12 of them in a 3-color deck and
Sure.
get away with it. It's not going to work out for you.
Yeah, no. I mean, well, you certainly could play all 12 of them in a 3-color deck.
I wouldn't recommend it.
But yeah, it won't work out as well for you as you'd hope. Definitely not as good as Shocklands did. And I actually think, I still think it's much better for aggressive decks. I think it's so nice to put this in an aggressive deck where you can actually just go, a mana base that has a bunch of basics of each color, and then this, and then switch when you need to, right? Like, if you have a hand that has a plains and the white-black thing, you can play it on black for turn 1, and then on turn 2 you can cast your white 2-drop, right? And reverse, right? Like you can, if you have the swamp and the white black land, you can play it for white on 1, cast your white 1-drop, and your black 2-drop on 2.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that I see what you're saying in the sense that it's untapped land on turn 1, which is really big.
Yep.
But I just think from a deck building standpoint, I think the constraint really exists in colors and less about if you want the lands untapped early.
Sure.
But
So you're probably right that you want it to be in a 2-color deck, but I do think that is a really big deal for. Usually aggressive decks are 2 colors, and the controlling decks we've seen recently have all tended to be 3 colors because you're really incentivized to look for answers that different colors provide to your control deck because you need a diversified answer suite. And if you're playing something like a blue-black control deck, you're oftentimes incentivized to splash green or splash white so you can get disenchant effects or anything like that, and these lands just aren't going to help you do that. So I think from the perspective of, yeah, you're going to want to play synergistic 2-color decks, those tend to be better aggressive decks.
yeah, I agree. I think control decks definitely get the luxury of being able to play more tap lands, which means you get better mana bases,
Yep.
which lends you to being with 3 colors. So that's a good point. I agree.
And I also just think looking at standard, you'll probably still play some of these in your control decks, but the control decks are often going to be decks utilizing the triomes, would be my guess. And if that's the case, you might be better off looking at other lands to add to your deck than these dual lands. Although these dual lands will still be good in those kind of decks, you aren't going to be heavy on them like you said.
Right. And one point I will make is that I think these lands get better the older the format, but stops at modern. I think for like historic, pioneer, and modern, these lands will be very good in the 2-color decks that are available to them. I mean, really, it's just as simple as cutting 2 of each of your basics that are in those colors.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're not cutting down too much on your fetch targets, it's almost free, right? Like it's
Yeah, definitely agree.
trivial inclusion.
They also pair pretty well with Fabled Passage in that they're good early, and then you can use your Fabled Passage later to be an untapped land, and that matters a lot in Historic and Pioneer because there aren't any other fetch lands in those formats.
Yep.
And both of those formats like that card.
And all those cards, including the fetch land and Fable Passage, all force you down the path of exactly 1 color every single time.
Yep.
So you have to be very conscious of what you're trying to cast throughout turns 1 through 4 in that situation.
Sure. I do like that they punish you for getting too greedy, because we've seen it in the past where it was just the mana was perfect all the time and you could just be as greedy as you wanted. And I like when there's some punishment there.
For sure.
I will also say, too, that I have tried to build some decks in Pioneer and in Historic that were like green-white aggressive. And it's really, really hard to build those decks because the mana is so bad in allied colors.
Yes.
And this doesn't fulfill every single color combination. We're still missing 4 of them. But for green-white, for example, it was so important to have green-white duels so you could cast white spells later in the curve, but have an untapped green land on turn 1 that could cast your elves. That was super crucial,
Yep.
and there just was not a good choice for that. There wasn't a green-white pain land. There wasn't a green-white fast land like, a Spire Bluff Canal. There was no green-white, which is Razor Ridge Thicket, but that one is not in Pioneer or Historic. There just wasn't the options there, and this really hits a big role in those formats.
Yeah, same thing Zach said, but for me, I tried building red-green aggro decks.
Yep.
Decks that were, once again, really leaning hard on a turn 1 Land War Elf, but you're casting turn 2 Rattle Masters. Actually pretty similar to the Naya Winota decks, right?
Yep.
And that's a deck that's going to get 2 or 3 of those lands and put it to good use.
I was going to say the Naya Winota deck is a deck we've played many times on our Making Magic Happen series, and the deck is super powerful. It's a really good deck, but holy cow is the mana bad. And it really punishes you because you don't have the good early green-red duels or the good early green-white duels, and you ended up having to play Mana Confluence and other pain lands, and you're off colors. And I lost the game on camera where my opponent never damaged me, and I took 20 damage from Mana Confluence or something ridiculous. And it's just like having a good way to play your elves is going to just make that deck so much better.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't limited to only the allied color combinations. Even the enemy colors, despite having better mana in general because of the fast lands and the pain lands, they're still going to play. Like, I played the white-black deck that at PT Phoenix that
Sure.
I did pretty well with, and I would happily slot in for the that new land without a
Yep.
question. Being able to cast in any of the black decks, being able to cast Thoughtseize and Pale Push on turn 1 is huge. You saw Blue Black Converter before it got banned was leaning on cards like Choked Estuary and Fetid Pools, and those cards are not very good.
No, those cards are terrible.
This new Blue Black land would easily slot into that deck, and they'd be very happy about it.
Oh yeah, that would have been a 4 of. Not even close. No
Yeah.
question. Okay, so let's move on to the other cycle of
Well, I just want
lands.
to
Oh.
out there for our viewers. The 6 lands that we're receiving in this set are going to be the blue-red, the black-white, the red-white, the red-green, the green-white, and the blue-black. So we're still waiting on 4 more. I think a really noteworthy exclusion was the blue-green. I think we've seen blue-green be very good for about a year now.
Yep.
So the fact that they're excluding blue-green from being part of the first format of the new post-rotation standard, it's pretty noteworthy, especially because Uro, as we've seen in our previous videos, is a card that we think is going to be probably the best card in the format.
Yeah, absolutely agree. We think Uro is going to be fantastic, and being able to get away from blue-green based on the fact that the mana is better in other colors is real, because otherwise I feel like there'd be so many decks just splashing Uro.
Absolutely, it'll be everywhere. I'm sure it still will be, but I'm glad that they're making it a little harder for them.
Sure, definitely agree. Okay, so let's actually move on to the other cycle now. Most of this cycle is not spoiled. We don't know what a lot of them will look like, but we do know what the cycle is doing. We saw 2 copies of this land cycle. So what it is it's a flip card, right? Same thing with the pathway cycle. You choose one side, and that's the side the spell is on, or land. On one side it's a spell. On the other side it's a tapped land. So, for instance, there's a red one, Valakut Stoneforge, or something.
That sounds right.
I think that was the name. It's just a red land that comes into play tapped on one side. On the other side, it's a 3-minute instant that says put any number of cards from your hand onto the bottom of your library, and then draw that many cards plus 1. And I think this cycle of lands is going to be the best thing from the set by an absolute mile, and I know you disagreed with me.
I do. I still think the lands that we just finished discussing will have a larger impact, especially in older formats. I think that this cycle is incredibly great, very good. I think it's a positive thing for Magic in general, because anything that helps mitigate the flood screw aspect of Magic is a positive thing, because it's definitely the thing that leads to the most feel bad games in general. So I think it's very good. I don't want to give off the appearance that I don't like the cycle. I just think that the previous cycle will just be an auto include in almost every mana base, in Pioneer for sure. Definitely see it in Modern, Historic for sure, Standard for sure. These ones, I think people are forgetting that a tap land is not free, especially when it's taps for 1 color, and we're just coming off of a set in Ikoria that rewards you for playing 3-colored spells. I think that's the thing that people are forgetting a little bit, and it also matters how good the front side is. And so, like, people are like, oh, well, this is kind of similar to maybe the Forgotten Keep cycle.
Sure.
But if the front half of the card reads worse than 1 mana cycle just to draw a card,
Yep.
which they very well might, then it's
Some of
a
them will.
worse cycle, right?
Sure.
Obviously, we haven't seen the cards yet. If these spells are like cards that we want to be playing on our decks, and then have the bonus of being lands on the back end, that's beautiful. And deck building is gonna be so interesting going forward now, because now it's
I
like
agree.
you can't start with, oh, I'm gonna play 27 lands and 33 spells, or 26 lands and 34 spells. How many of these crossovers are you gonna play?
Yeah, so I'm kind of looking at this different, and I disagree with you that these aren't better than the other cycle. My feeling is you already can play tap lands in a lot of decks, and we're starting to see a trend in Standard, especially Standard. Older formats less so, even though we are seeing in older formats, but older formats less so. But in Standard, you wanted to be playing 30 land decks. You just
True.
want it to be, and the problem with those decks is sometimes you flood, right? It wasn't that often because you had Uro to just kind of smooth all of these things over, but there
Or
were
Hydrate Crisis,
or
to dump
Hydrate
mana
Crisis,
into.
sure. But there were games you flooded, right? That happened some percentage of the time. But the games where you didn't hit the land drop of your Uro, you almost always lost. So the consensus was you should be playing 30 lands, and flooding is better than screwing in Standard. And that is just still true, I believe. And with that being the case, the fact that you can play a 34 land deck that also can have like 32 spells in it is ridiculous. The consistency you're going to get out of this is absolutely insane.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I just I can play 34 lands in my deck right now and not have them be spell-sided.
Sure.
But obviously that's not something you want to be doing, because you're opening yourself up to flood. But if the spell is bad enough, then it's going to feel close enough to that, right?
Sure.
So I think it's important that we see that the spells are cards that aren't maybe something we'd play under normal circumstances, but like not too far off, plus have the added bonus of being a land. I don't think we can be playing like 2 mana, gain 5 life, and then have a land on the back end. I think that card's going to be like,
Sure.
it's almost always going to want to be a land, and at that point, it's just a bad plains, right?
I mean, that is true. It really depends on how powerful the front half is, but if recent power level of standard sets is any indication, my prediction is that some of these lands are going to be just good spells, and if any of them are just good spells, those cards are going to be absolutely ridiculous. And I do think the red one is very, very good.
Yeah, let's talk about the ones that we have so far. So we have the first one, the red one that you mentioned.
Yep. I mean, compare that to the cycle lands. And first of all, the cycling triomes are insanely good. Obviously, those tap for 3 colors and have land type, so the land half is significantly better than the other half. But 3 mana to cycle is a heavy cost. That's very expensive, and that's not something a lot of decks can afford. You kind of need to be controlling to be able to pay 3 to cycle. Now, this land is also 3 to cycle in a sense, right? But it gets to cycle other cards out of your hand, and it can set up combos. Like if you're playing Luca, for instance, being able to put the weird expensive creature that's just stuck in your hand, you're never casting, back on the bottom of your library to trigger Luca again. It's absolutely ridiculous.
No, I completely agree. I really like this card so far. One of those things where, like, you know, sometimes when you're playing Magic, you mulligan to 6. You don't really want to mulligan anymore, but you're sitting there with a handful of lands. In those situations, you can be like, okay, well, I have this 3 mana, this land that can actually just ship all these extra lands and kind of give me a fresh start, so I'll keep. And like usually the effect of like discard X amount of cards, draw X amount of cards, or discard X amount of cards, draw X amount of cards plus 1 isn't playable, but you staple to a land is
super
easy,
good.
Yeah.
I mean, when I looked at it too, I was like, okay, yeah, it's really good in all those scenarios you just mentioned. It's also really insane that you can play it in a prowess deck, right? Prowess decks are the type of decks that, you know, really want to cheat on lands, but also hate missing their land drops. They just hate it because the next turn they want to be able to cast all their stuff. And this just being almost like a brainstorm for 3 mana, it's not as good. It's not as good, but
come down a little bit.
It's not as good. Don't get me wrong. It's not as good as brainstorm, certainly, but it does do that same thing where if you have a bad hand and you want to fix it, you can just fix it, and it's at the cost of having a land, and that's so ridiculous. This card looks good in a prowess deck because you can play a 24, 26 land prowess deck and still get the benefit of having a deck that feels like it's, you know, only playing 20 lands and the 26 spells or whatever you need to be playing to complement the 12 to 14 prowess creatures you play, and I think that's going to be super powerful. The other thing too is this card is awesome in control decks. We've seen control decks specifically have a really hard time having dead removal spells. The removal spells aren't very answer everything anymore. They're very conditional at this point in standard. You have, you know, cards like Shock, which are really, really good when you play against decks that have cheap creatures, but not very good when you play against a deck with Uros. Or, you know, you play maybe expensive counter spells, which you really want against decks with bigger spells, but stink against decks with cheap creatures. And the fact that you have a land that can fix your hand every time is so ridiculous.
No, I don't disagree with you. I think this card's very strong. I just think that as the format gets older, I think these cards start losing value because playing a tap land or having a 3 mana spell that tries to clean up your draws are just, both sides are really bad. And I get that it's a sum of 2 halves and it gets better as a result, but I think we just, as the format gets higher power level, having good fast mana beats everything.
That is true. So I would agree, the faster the format, the worse these get, especially when they're expensive on one side to make up for the fact that they're basically free to put in your deck as a land on the other side. I will say, though, I've been playing a lot of Jeskai Luca. I think that people know that. And, yeah, this deck, this card in Luca is so, so good. I am so excited for it.
It's perfect for the card.
It's so perfect.
Luca stick around in standard.
Yep.
So it's definitely something we need to pay attention to if we get that big payout that we're looking for in Zendikar.
I mean, we have a red-white duel in the Pathway land.
True.
We've got this land to fix Luca. We've got Birth of Meletus. Yeah, so there's an Izzet land. We could certainly see Luca make a resurgence. That card has proven to be much better than it looked like it would be for spoiler season. So we'll see what happens with that in standard.
We have one more card to talk about here, right?
Yep, let's hit on this black land.
Yeah, so the black one is a it's a tapped swamp on the backside. I'm sorry, it's not a swamp, it just taps for a black mana. They do not have the land type. On the front half, it's a sorcery. It's a black and 2, so 3 mana. Look at your opponent's hand, or your opponent reveals their hand, and then you discard a card that costs 3 or more. So what do you think about this card, Zach?
So I do think it's awesome that the card hits expensive stuff and not cheap stuff. I think the fact that it's an appetite for brains, I guess you'd say, instead of an Inquisition of Kozilek.
There's actually a card that costs a 3 mana. The name's escaping me, but it was a sorcery that you can either exile. Your opponent exiles a creature they control, or you can look at their hand and exile a card.
Doom Foretold?
Doom Foretold. No, not Doom Foretold.
Or Doomfall. Doomfall.
Doomfall.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what this card reminds me of.
It,
Only instead of having the flexibility of having it be a rule spell on the board, it's a land.
Sure. I mean, I think this card is very good. There's plenty of decks where, you're playing like in a black deck, you're playing against a deck that has a lot of creatures, and cheap deck, cheap spells. You can just play your land, play your removal spell, put this into play tapped, move on with your life. But the fact that you get free interaction against the decks kind of trying to do degenerate stuff, like let's say a Luca deck, just having interaction with the more expensive broken things is just so good, especially when it comes in your deck at the cost of being a tapped land.
Right. And I will point out the fact that we have confirmed that there's both a rare cycle and an uncommon cycle.
Yep.
So I want to make the point here that, like, let's say we've seen that the uncommon cycle for the black one is a discard spell.
Yep.
Which tends to lean better against towards control, combo,
Sure.
etc. If we find that the rare cycle is the one that's good against like cheap creatures, you basically have to get to build your deck in a way that when you're playing against aggro decks, you have one turns into land always and one's the removal spell always.
Yep.
And then when you're playing against a controller combo deck, one's a land always, one's a discard spell. So you almost get like a split card out of your spell while also being able to mitigate the flood screw aspect of games in general. I think that's really cool.
I totally agree. I love it that like you just will always be able to play. I mean, that is one of the most frustrating things in Magic is when you're playing a match that matters and you just don't draw that fourth land, and all you needed was one more land to be able to cast, turn your whole hand on, but you never got there and you just didn't play, and that's awful. And the fact that now we can play decks that actually approach 30 lands but aren't cost you in the spell slot is going to be amazing.
For sure. I mean, there's going to be those moments where you're begging for your fourth land and you draw this one and you're like, well, Temple of Tilt, tap land, go.
Sure.
But it's definitely better than missing your land drop altogether. I think this cycle is just very good.
I'm really excited for them in Standard. I'm going to say I am still a little scared that they might be too good. I'm really hoping that they're more along the lines of this red spell, which is very good. It's certainly an awesome thing to have in your deck, but it's by no means broken.
Well, so I would like to say that, like, the cards we've seen in the past year of Standard are cards that are just super high power in a vacuum compacted into what the card does. These cards are not powerful because of how good a 3-mana dip cards into your bottom library draw that many cards +1 is, or a 3-mana discard spell. The power lies in the fact that it reduces opportunity cost, reduces deck building constraints, it reduces variance in losing games because of non-games.
Definitely.
So I think the fact that they're turning the knobs on that aspect of the game is actually a good thing. I don't think that we're actually going to find that we're unhappy with how the game is being played out as a result of this. I think we'll never be disappointed when our opponent casts it as a spell. We'll just be like, oh, that could have been a land, but it's not. But that's okay because they get to keep playing the game.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I would like to see more of this, where you get power from flexibility and less power from rate, a.k.a. Oko, although he was power on all fronts, so I don't know about that one. But
You never got screwed out of
still
casting
flexible, yeah, okay, whatever. Well, that's not a good example. That card is banned for a reason. Okay, so with that, we're going to leave you guys for today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Remember, if you like these videos we're making, subscribe to us on YouTube, leave a like on this video, leave a comment. We're happy to discuss all these things with you.
Tell us which cycle you like more and why.
It's definitely a spell cycle, but we can show the comments after and we'll prove it. But yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.